Dr. Lisa Monroe stared at the data flowing across her screen aboard the research vessel USS Liberty. The numbers looked wrong. They had been talking with the alien visitors for 3 days now, and something felt very strange about their technology. She turned to her partner, Dr. Kevin Hayes, who sat at the next station. "Kevin, look at these readings," she said quietly. "The alien devices they gave us have extra circuits that they did not tell us about." Kevin leaned over and studied the screen. His face grew worried as he saw the hidden patterns in the alien technology. "These look like control systems," he whispered. "Why would they hide this from us?" Captain Jake Sullivan walked onto the bridge of his diplomatic ship. He had been chosen to lead humanity's first contact with alien life. The Zephyrian Collective seemed friendly enough. They offered trade, protection, and membership in their galactic community. It sounded too good to be true, and Captain Sullivan had learned to be careful of things that seemed perfect. Ambassador Kael'Vath of the Drakmori race stood waiting in the main meeting room. His reptilian features showed what humans assumed was a smile. The collective controlled 12 different alien species across hundreds of worlds. They claimed to be peaceful traders who helped younger species grow and develop. "Captain Sullivan," Kael'Vath said in perfect English, "have you considered our generous offer? Your species would benefit greatly from joining our community." Sullivan nodded politely. "We are still discussing it with our people back on Earth. This is a big decision for humanity." "Of course," the alien replied, "but time is important. There are dangerous forces in this galaxy. Species that refuse our protection often face terrible fates." Commander Amy Brooks watched the conversation from her position near the door. She ran military intelligence for the human fleet. Something about the alien's words sounded more like a threat than friendly advice. She had been studying the other species in the collective, and what she found disturbed her. Every single member species showed signs of genetic changes and neural implants. Their brain patterns were different from what they should be naturally. It looked like someone had been changing them, making them more peaceful and obedient. The aliens claimed this was voluntary evolution, but Brooks suspected something much darker. Dr. Monroe continued her secret analysis of the alien gifts. The more she studied them, the more worried she became. The devices contained tiny machines called nanobots. These microscopic robots were designed to enter human bodies and change their brain chemistry. They would make humans more compliant and less likely to resist authority. "Ben, come here," she called to Chief Science Officer Ben Carter. "I need you to see this." Carter hurried over and looked at her findings. His face went pale as he understood what the aliens were really planning. "They're not trying to help us," he said. "They want to control us." "Exactly," Monroe replied. "And I think they've already started. Remember the welcoming ceremony yesterday? They released something into the air. I thought it was just decorative, but now I think it was nanobots." Carter felt a chill run down his spine. "How long do we have?" "Based on these patterns, maybe 72 hours before the nanobots fully activate and start changing our brain chemistry." Meanwhile, Captain Sullivan was trying to politely end his meeting with Kael'Vath. "Ambassador, we appreciate your offer, but we would like to return to Earth and discuss this with our government." The alien's expression changed. The friendly mask slipped away, revealing something cold and predatory underneath. "I am afraid that will not be possible, Captain. You see, the decision has already been made for you." Sullivan felt his blood turn cold. "What do you mean?" "Your species will join the collective whether you choose to or not. The integration process began during yesterday's ceremony. Within 3 days, you and your crew will be much more reasonable and cooperative." Alarms began sounding throughout the human ships. The alien space station's defensive systems had activated, trapping the human vessels with powerful energy fields. Escape was impossible. Commander Brooks immediately activated the emergency protocols. She sent urgent messages to all human ships, warning them that they were under attack. But the alien jamming systems were already interfering with their communications. Dr. Monroe worked frantically in her laboratory. If the nanobots were already in their systems, she needed to find a way to stop them. She had been developing experimental neural shielding technology that might protect against alien mind control. It was untested and dangerous, but it was their only hope. "Kevin, help me modify these neural shields," she said urgently. "We need to protect as many people as possible." They worked together, racing against time as alien boarding parties prepared to dock with the human ships. The collective had done this many times before. They would overwhelm the humans with superior numbers, then wait for the nanobots to make them peaceful and cooperative. Captain Sullivan gathered his senior officers for an emergency meeting. "We're trapped," he told them. "The aliens never intended to let us leave. They want to enslave us like they did to the other species." "What are our options?" asked Commander Brooks. "Very few," Sullivan replied grimly. "We're outnumbered and outgunned, but we're not giving up without a fight." Dr. Monroe burst into the meeting room. "Captain, I have neural shields that might protect us from their mind control nanobots. But I only have enough for about 20 people." Sullivan nodded. "Give them to the core military team. If anyone is going to resist, it should be our fighters." The alien boarding parties began cutting through the human ship hulls. They expected easy victory. Every other species had surrendered once the nanobots started working. Resistance always crumbled when the will to fight was chemically suppressed, but they had never faced humans before. Sergeant Chris Parker and his Marines prepared for battle. They wore Dr. Monroe's experimental neural shields, hoping the untested technology would protect them. The aliens were about to learn that some species could not be easily tamed. The first alien soldiers stepped through the breached hull, expecting to find docile humans ready for processing. Instead, they met fierce resistance from creatures who seemed to grow more dangerous when threatened. The battle for humanity's freedom was about to begin, and the galaxy would never be the same. The alien boarding parties expected to find confused and frightened humans. Instead, they walked into a nightmare. Sergeant Chris Parker and his Marines had positioned themselves throughout the ship's corridors, turning every doorway into a killing zone. The neural shields that Dr. Monroe created were working, protecting them from the nanobots that should have made them docile. Parker crouched behind a bulkhead as reptilian Dracomori soldiers advanced down the hallway. Their weapons were designed to stun and capture, not kill. They wanted live prisoners for processing. That mistake would cost them dearly. "Now," Parker whispered into his communicator. Corporal Lisa White triggered the explosive charges they had placed in the ceiling. Metal and debris rained down on the aliens, crushing several and blocking their advance. The survivors found themselves trapped in a confined space with humans who fought like wild animals. The Dracomori had never experienced anything like human combat tactics. Their own species had been pacified centuries ago, their natural predatory instincts suppressed by collective technology. They remembered war only as historical data, not as a living reality. The humans showed them what real violence looked like. Private Don Torres moved through the ship's ventilation system, appearing behind enemy positions like a ghost. He carried improvised weapons made from ship components and human ingenuity. The aliens had superior technology, but they lacked the desperate creativity that comes from fighting for survival. On the bridge, Captain Sullivan coordinated the resistance, while most of his crew stood around with blank, peaceful expressions. The nanobots had worked on them, turning trained officers into compliant sheep. Only those wearing neural shields remained free to fight. Commander Brooks managed to establish contact with the other human ships. The situation was the same everywhere. Most of the crews had been mentally compromised, leaving only small groups of shielded personnel to resist the alien takeover. "Sullivan to all free personnel," the captain broadcast on a secure channel. "We're outnumbered, but we're not defeated. Make them pay for every inch of our ships." Dr. Monroe worked desperately in her laboratory while alien soldiers searched. For her, she was developing a way to reverse the nanobots' effects, but she needed time and resources. The sound of gunfire grew closer as the aliens methodically swept through the ship. Kevin Hayes burst into her lab, his face grim. "Lisa, we have to go. They're almost here." Not yet, she replied, still working on her computer. I'm so close to finding a way to free our people. An explosion rocked the ship as Parker's team detonated another booby trap. The aliens were learning that humans did not fight like other species. They were willing to destroy their own property to deny it to the enemy. They seemed to prefer death to surrender. The collective forces had conquered hundreds of worlds using the same methods. Overwhelming technology, nanobots to suppress resistance, and the promise of peaceful integration. It had worked perfectly for thousands of years. No species had ever maintained effective resistance once the nanobots began working, but humans were different. Even those affected by the nanobots retained some spark of defiance. They moved slowly and spoke softly, but their eyes still held traces of anger. The collective psychologists had never seen anything like it. Kale Voth watched the battle reports with growing concern. His forces should have secured all human ships within hours. Instead, they were taking heavy casualties from a handful of resistant fighters. The humans were using tactics that seemed almost insane, sacrificing themselves to inflict maximum damage on their captors. Increase the nanobot concentration, he ordered his technicians. Double the dosage if necessary. But the additional nanobots had no effect on the shielded humans. If anything, they seemed to fight harder when they learned about the increased mind control attempts. Their fury was something the collective had never encountered before. Commander Brooks led a strike team to the ship's communication array. If they could send the message to Earth, humanity might have a chance to prepare for what was coming. The aliens had jammed most communications, but there was still one narrowband frequency that might work. She fought through corridors filled with her own converted crew members. The nanobots had made them peaceful, but they still tried to stop her in their gentle, confused way. It was heartbreaking to see trained warriors reduced to docile children, but Brooks pushed forward. Someone had to warn Earth. The communication array was heavily guarded by alien soldiers. Brooks and her team used human military tactics that the collective had never seen before. They created diversions, used psychological warfare, and fought with a brutality that shocked their captors. "This is Commander Brooks to Earth Command," she broadcast on the emergency frequency. "Humanity is under attack. The aliens are trying to enslave us with mind control technology. Prepare for war. Trust. No alien gifts or technology. They want to make us like their other slave species." The message was brief but clear. Earth would know that the first contact mission had failed and that humanity faced extinction as a free species. How they responded would determine the fate of both species. Dr. Monroe finally completed her analysis of the nanobots. She discovered something that gave her hope. The tiny machines were designed to work on brain chemistry that had been pre-programmed by the collective. Human brains were different enough that the nanobots could not achieve complete control. There was always a small part of the human mind that remained free. "Kevin, look at this," she said excitedly. "We can reverse the process. If we can create the right electromagnetic pulse, we can disrupt the nanobots and free our people." Hayes studied her data. "But we would need access to the ship's main power core. That's in the section the aliens have already captured." Monroe smiled grimly. "Then we'll have to take it back." Meanwhile, Sergeant Parker and his remaining Marines had turned the ship's cargo bay into a fortress. They had welded metal plates together to create barriers and positioned captured alien weapons at strategic points. The collective forces had superior numbers, but they had to come through narrow doorways to reach the humans. Corporal White had discovered something interesting about alien psychology. The collective species had been pacified for so long that they were almost incapable of understanding human tactics. They expected logical, predictable behavior. Instead, they faced opponents who seemed to thrive on chaos and improvisation. "They're scared," White reported to Parker. "I can see it in their body language. They've never fought anyone who actually wanted to hurt them." Parker nodded. "Good. Fear makes people stupid. Let's use that against them." The battle raged throughout the human fleet, but something unexpected was happening. The other species in the collective were watching the fight through their ship's communication systems. They saw humans choosing death over surrender, fighting with desperate courage against impossible odds. For the first time in centuries, the enslaved species began to remember what resistance looked like. The nanobots in their own systems could not completely suppress the emotions stirred by watching humanity struggle. Deep in their altered minds, something ancient began to awaken. The collective leadership realized they had made a terrible mistake. They had assumed humans would be like every other species, easily conquered and controlled. Instead, they had found a species that seemed to grow more dangerous when threatened. The humans were not just resisting, they were inspiring others to remember what freedom meant. The galaxy was about to change forever. Commander Brooks' message reached Earth just as the massive collective fleet dropped out of hyperspace near the outer planets. General Rick Stone stood in the command center of Earth's defense headquarters, watching the sensor displays with grim determination. Hundreds of alien warships had come to finish what they started with the diplomatic mission. The aliens expected to find a backward planet with primitive defenses. Instead, they discovered that humanity had spent the last 6 months turning their entire world into a weapon. Every major city had been fortified. Orbital platforms bristled with experimental weapons, and the asteroid belt had become a deadly maze of mines and automated gun platforms. Dr. Kevin Hayes had worked around the clock to mass-produce the neural shielding technology that Dr. Monroe had developed. Every human soldier, pilot, and civilian volunteer now wore protection against alien mind control. The nanobots that had enslaved a dozen species would find no purchase in human minds. Admiral Carol Jenkins commanded Earth's defense fleet from the bridge of the battleship USS Defiance. Her ships were outnumbered 50-1, but they carried weapons that the collective had never seen before. Human engineers had studied the captured alien technology and found ways to turn it against its creators. The first wave of collective ships approached Earth's outer defenses with confidence. They had conquered hundreds of worlds using the same strategy. Overwhelming force followed by nanobots to pacify the population. No species had ever mounted effective resistance once their leaders were compromised, but as the alien fleet entered the asteroid belt, they discovered that humans had prepared surprises. Hidden among the space rocks were weapons designed not just to destroy ships, but to terrify their crews. Nuclear mines detonated in patterns that created screaming faces visible across the electromagnetic spectrum. Gravity bombs turned asteroids into projectiles that smashed through alien hulls. The psychological warfare was deliberate. Dr. Hayes had realized that the collective species had been pacified for so long that they had almost no experience with real fear. The humans intended to teach them what terror felt like. Captain Jake Sullivan and the survivors from the diplomatic mission were being held prisoner aboard the collective flagship. He watched through the viewports as human defenses tore into the alien fleet. Despite his desperate situation, he felt pride in his species' refusal to surrender. Kael'Voth stood beside him, no longer bothering to maintain his friendly facade. The reptilian alien's true nature was visible now, cold and predatory. But there was something else in his expression that Sullivan had never seen before: uncertainty. "Your species is more troublesome than we anticipated," Kael'Voth admitted. "But this resistance will only make your eventual submission more complete. We have crushed hundreds of rebellions." Sullivan smiled grimly. "You've never faced a rebellion like this one. Humans don't break the same way other species do." The battle intensified as Admiral Jenkins led her fleet in attacks that horrified the collective commanders. Human ships used ramming tactics, nuclear self-destructions, and weapons designed to cause maximum psychological damage. They broadcast the screams of dying aliens across all frequencies, making sure every enemy ship could hear the cost of attacking humanity. The collective forces had advanced shields and weapons, but they lacked the desperate creativity that drove human tactics. Admiral Jenkins ordered her ships to use strategies that seemed suicidal to alien minds. Human vessels would sacrifice themselves to take out larger enemy ships, their crews volunteering for missions with no chance of survival. Dr. Monroe, still trapped aboard the alien space station, managed to complete her work on reversing the nanobots. She activated an electromagnetic pulse that freed dozens of human prisoners, including Captain Sullivan and several key officers. The freed humans immediately began sabotaging critical systems throughout the station. The liberation of the human prisoners created chaos in the collective command structure. They had never dealt with escaped slaves who retained their fighting spirit. The humans spread throughout the station like a virus, turning captured weapons against their former captors and broadcasting information about collective weaknesses to the human fleet. But the most shocking development was happening among the collective's enslaved species. The crews of alien ships were watching humans fight with a passion they had never seen before. Despite their neural conditioning, something deep in their genetic memory began to stir. They started to remember what their ancestors had been like. Before the collective tamed them, General Stone coordinated Earth's defense from his underground command center. The planet's surface was under heavy bombardment, but humanity had prepared for this. Entire cities had been moved underground, connected by tunnel networks that spanned continents. The collective could destroy the surface, but they could not reach the heart of human resistance. The turning point came when human forces captured an intact collective dreadnought. The ship's crew had been overcome by fear when human boarding parties used tactics that seemed to come from their worst nightmares. The aliens surrendered rather than face creatures who seemed to enjoy violence. Dr. Hayes used the captured ship's communication system to broadcast across the galaxy. He transmitted recordings of human resistance, showing enslaved species what freedom looked like. The images of humans choosing death over surrender spread through the collective's own networks, reaching worlds that had been pacified for centuries. On the prison world of Terminus, representatives of the 12 enslaved species watched the broadcasts in amazement. For the first time in their lives, they saw beings who refused to accept slavery. The nanobots in their systems tried to suppress their emotional responses, but the images were too powerful. Something was awakening in minds that had been sleeping for generations. Commander Brooks led a strike team that captured the collective's main communication relay. Instead of destroying it, she used it to coordinate with rebel cells that were spontaneously forming across the galaxy. The human tactics that had proven so effective were being adapted by species who were remembering how to fight. The battle for Earth raged for days, but the outcome was already decided. The collective had expected to face a primitive world. Instead, they found a species that turned warfare into an art form. Every human defeat only inspired greater resistance. Every alien victory came at a cost that shocked the collective leadership. Admiral Jenkins broadcast a message that reached every ship in both fleets. "You came here to enslave us," she said. "But you've made a mistake that will cost you everything. You've reminded the galaxy what freedom looks like. Your slaves are watching. US fight, and they're remembering what they used to be. This isn't just a battle for Earth. This is the beginning of your empire's end." The words proved prophetic. Across hundreds of worlds, enslaved species began to malfunction in ways the collective had never seen. Work stopped, orders were ignored. And worst of all, some began to actively resist their masters. The nanobots that had controlled them for centuries were failing against emotions too powerful to suppress. Kael'Voth realized that his species had made a fatal error. They had assumed humans would be like every other species they had conquered. Instead, they had awakened something that threatened the very foundation of their empire. The humans were not just fighting for themselves. They were teaching the galaxy to remember what it meant to be free. The battle for Earth was ending, but the war for galactic freedom was just beginning. Earth burned under alien bombardment, but humanity's spirit remained unbroken. Colonel Pete Morgan watched from his underground bunker as collective forces tried to establish control over the planet's surface. They had won the battle for Earth's skies, but they were about to learn that conquering humanity required more than defeating their military. The survivors of the human fleet, including Admiral Jenkins and thousands of crew members, were transported to the collective's prison world of Terminus. The aliens believed that removing human leaders from Earth would end the resistance. They had no idea that every human was capable of leadership when freedom was at stake. Dr. Rachel Taylor found herself in a prison cell next to representatives of species she had only seen in intelligence reports. The Veltar were aquatic beings with highly advanced engineering skills. The Corvani were insectoid creatures who had once been master strategists. All had been enslaved so long that they barely remembered their original nature. "Why do you resist?" asked Equinine, a Veltar scientist whose gills fluttered nervously. "Resistance only brings suffering. The collective provides order and peace." Dr. Taylor studied the alien's face, seeing the neural implants that glowed softly beneath translucent skin. "Because peace without choice is not peace at all, it's just slow death." The words seemed to hit something deep in Aquinine's modified mind. For a moment, the Veltar's eyes cleared, showing a glimpse of what the species had been before their enslavement. The nanobots quickly reasserted control, but the seed had been planted. Colonel Morgan began organizing the human prisoners into resistance cells. The collective had made another critical error by concentrating so many humans in one location. Instead of breaking their spirit, it allowed them to coordinate and plan. Within days, the prison world became a training ground for revolution. The humans taught other species things that had been surgically removed from their cultures. They showed the Drakmori how to hunt without mercy. They reminded the Corvani of strategic thinking that went beyond simple logistics. Most importantly, they demonstrated that authority could be questioned and defied. On Earth, General Stone led the resistance from a network of tunnels that spanned entire continents. The planet's surface might be occupied, but humanity had gone underground in the most literal sense. Every attempt by collective forces to establish permanent control met with sabotage, ambush, and psychological warfare. The aliens tried to use their standard pacification techniques on the human population. They released nanobots into the atmosphere, broadcast calming frequencies, and offered food and shelter to those who surrendered. But human neural shielding protected most of the population, and those who were affected still retained enough free will to cause problems. Captain Sullivan escaped from his cell on Terminus using techniques he had learned from Sergeant Parker. The Marines' guerrilla warfare lessons had been passed through the human prisoners, creating a knowledge network that the collective could not monitor or control. Sullivan found himself in the prison's main computer center, where he discovered files that shocked him. The collective's records showed the true history of galactic conquest. Species after species had been systematically enslaved, their cultures stripped away and replaced with artificial compliance. Children were born already modified, never knowing what their ancestors had been capable of achieving. It was genocide, disguised as peaceful integration. Dr. Monroe, working with equipment salvaged from the prison's medical bay, made a breakthrough in reversing neural conditioning. She discovered that the enslaved species retained genetic memories of their original nature. With the right combination of electromagnetic therapy and psychological triggers, she could awaken dormant instincts. The first successful test was performed on a young Corvani named Click 7. The insectoid alien had been born in captivity, never knowing anything but servitude. But when Dr. Monroe activated the suppressed portions of its brain, something remarkable happened. Click 7 began to think strategically, seeing patterns and possibilities that had been blocked for its entire life. "I remember," Click 7 whispered, its compound eyes focusing with new intelligence. "My people were warriors once. We conquered through superior tactics, not brute force. What have they done to us?" The awakening spread through the prison population like wildfire. As each species rediscovered its true nature, they began teaching others. The Veltar remembered their engineering brilliance. The Drakmori recalled their predatory cunning. The humans had not just freed individual prisoners. They had begun to restore entire civilizations. Commander Brooks coordinated with resistance cells across dozens of worlds, using the collective's own communication networks. The aliens had designed their systems to be unbreakable by their pacified subjects, but they had never considered that someone might teach those subjects how to think creatively again. The first major victory came when liberated prisoners on Terminus captured a collective supply ship. But instead of trying to escape, they turned the vessel's weapons against the prison world's defense systems. The ship's broadcast equipment began transmitting proof of the collective's crimes across the galaxy. The evidence was overwhelming. Recorded confessions from collective leaders, documentation of forced genetic modification, and visual proof of what the enslaved species had been before their conquest. The broadcasts reached every world in the Empire, sparking reactions that the collective could not suppress on Drakmori Prime. Workers in the agricultural centers suddenly remembered that their ancestors had been apex predators. The nanobots tried to suppress their awakening instincts, but genetic memory proved stronger than artificial conditioning. Within hours, the planet's entire industrial system collapsed as workers refused to continue their docile labor. General Stone received reports that similar uprisings were occurring throughout the galaxy. The human example had created a chain reaction that the collective could not stop. Species that had been enslaved for centuries were throwing off their chains, guided by human tactics and inspired by human courage. The prison world of Terminus became the center of a new kind of warfare. Colonel Morgan trained former slaves in guerrilla tactics while Dr. Taylor worked to free more minds from artificial conditioning. Every liberated alien became a teacher, spreading knowledge of resistance to others of their species. Kale Voth and the collective leadership faced their worst nightmare. Not only had they failed to enslave humanity, but their attempt had awakened every enslaved species in their empire. The rebels were using human-taught tactics that the collective had no experience countering. How do we fight an enemy that refuses to follow logical patterns? Kale Voth asked his military advisors. The humans teach chaos and call it strategy. They inspire others to choose death over safety. This goes against everything we know about civilized behavior. But the collective's definition of civilization was the problem. They had created an empire of slaves who had forgotten how to live as free beings. The humans reminded them that true civilization required the ability to choose one's own path, even if that path led to conflict. The revolution that began in a prison cell was spreading across the galaxy. Species that had been pacified for millennia were remembering what they had lost. The collective's greatest fear was becoming reality as their empire began to crumble from within. Admiral Jenkins, now leading the liberated forces on Terminus, prepared for the next phase of the war. They wanted to make us like them, she told her mixed species army. Instead, we're going to teach the galaxy what it means to be free. The final assault on the collective began not with human ships, but with fleets from all 12 formerly enslaved species fighting under human tactical command. Admiral Jenkins stood on the bridge of the USS Defiance, rebuilt from salvaged parts. An alien technology as she coordinated the largest military operation in galactic history, the irony was not lost on her. The collective had spent centuries building the perfect war machine by enslaving the galaxy's most capable species. Now those same species were using their natural abilities, enhanced by human tactical knowledge, to destroy their former masters, Drakmori. Warships, their crews rediscovering their predatory instincts, hunted collective vessels through asteroid fields with deadly patience. Veltar engineering ships had been converted into mobile weapons platforms, their aquatic crews designing new ways to disable enemy technology. The Corvani contributed strategic analysis that turned every battle into a precisely planned victory. Captain Sullivan led a mixed-species boarding party onto a collective command ship. The aliens inside had never faced enemies who combined multiple species' natural abilities with human tactical ruthlessness. Drakmori soldiers provided the physical strength. Corvani officers planned the assault routes, and humans coordinated everything with the desperate creativity that had sparked the rebellion. Remember, Sullivan told his team as they prepared to breach the enemy hull, we're not just fighting for victory. We're fighting to show the galaxy that freedom is worth any price. The boarding action was swift and brutal. The collective crew had grown soft during centuries of ruling over pacified subjects. They expected logical, predictable resistance that could be countered with superior technology. Instead, they faced an enemy that seemed to thrive on chaos and improvisation. On Earth, General Stone emerged from his underground bunkers to witness something unprecedented. The collective occupation forces were surrendering without a fight. Their own enslaved support species had turned against them, and the remaining alien commanders found themselves isolated and outnumbered. The planet's surface was scarred by months of bombardment, but humanity had survived. More than survived, they had inspired a galactic revolution that was sweeping away an empire that had stood for millennia. Dr. Monroe, now serving as Chief Science Officer for the Liberation Alliance, worked to undo the genetic modifications that had been imposed on the enslaved species. Her research stations on dozens of worlds were removing neural implants, reversing artificial conditioning, and helping entire civilizations rediscover their true nature. "It's remarkable," she told Dr. Hayes during one of their research conferences. "Every species the collective conquered had unique abilities that were being suppressed. The Veltar are natural engineers who can solve problems we never imagined. The Corvani think in patterns that make our best strategists look like children. They weren't enslaving inferior species, they were crippling superior ones." The final battle took place in the space around Nexus Prime, the collective's capital world. Kael'Voth commanded the last loyal forces from his flagship, watching as the empire he had helped build crumbled around him. The rebels approached his position not as a conquering army, but as representatives of every species the collective had wronged. "Surrender," Admiral Jenkins broadcast on all frequencies. "Your empire is finished. Your enslaved species are free. You have nothing left to fight for except pride." Kael'Voth's response revealed the true nature of the collective leadership. "We will not surrender to inferior beings. The galaxy needs order. Without our guidance, these species will destroy themselves with primitive emotions and chaotic thinking." "Maybe," Jenkins replied, "but that will be their choice to make." The final assault on the collective command ship was led by Colonel Morgan and a team of liberated prisoners from every enslaved species. They moved through the corridors with the confidence of beings who had learned what freedom meant and were willing to die to protect it. Kael'Voth made his last stand in the ship's command center, surrounded by the few remaining collective loyalists. He watched his enemies approach and saw something that terrified him more than death. They were not filled with hatred or desire for revenge. Instead, they showed the calm determination of beings who were simply removing an obstacle to galactic freedom. "You don't understand," he pleaded as they surrounded him. "Without the collective, there will be wars, conflicts, chaos. We brought peace to the galaxy." Captain Sullivan looked at the alien leader with something approaching pity. "You brought slavery. Real peace can only exist when people choose it freely." Dr. Taylor had established rehabilitation centers throughout the former collective territory. Former slave overseers and collective administrators were not executed or imprisoned. Instead, they were offered the same neural modification reversal that had been given to their victims. Many chose freedom over their artificial conditioning. Adding their knowledge to the growing Liberation Alliance, the transformation of galactic society happened remarkably quickly. Species that had been pacified for centuries threw themselves into rediscovering their lost cultures with enthusiasm that amazed human observers. The Drakmori established hunting fleets that explored unknown regions of space. The Veltar began engineering projects that dwarfed anything the collective had ever attempted. General Stone was elected as the first chairman of the Galactic Liberation Council, but he insisted that the position rotate among representatives of all species. "Humans didn't free the galaxy to rule it," he explained to the assembled delegates. "We did it to give everyone the right to rule themselves." The Council's first act was to establish the principles of galactic freedom. No species could be forced to join any organization. No genetic or neural modifications could be performed without informed consent. Every world had the right to determine its own government and culture. Most importantly, any species that attempted to enslave another would face the combined opposition. Of all free worlds, Dr. Monroe's research into the collective's technology led to discoveries that revolutionized Gal.